Good afternoon, everybody. So today we're going to look at two-dimensional arrays. I hope you had looked at the one-dimensional arrays and understood that nicely. So this is just basically the next step in where a one-dimensional array only had, depending on how you saw it, but either one line or one column of information. So it's like one set of names that was saved. What we busy with now is we're going to use a two-dimensional array. So now we've got rows and columns, not just the one of them. So in creating a two-dimensional array, in our program that I'm going to take for our example is for an airplane. Let's say we want to book a flight. Let's assume there's 5 rows and there's an aisle between rows C and D, or columns, and then 10 rows with the emergency exit. If you know how flights work, there's normally like a bigger space for the emergency exit, so there's a gap there. So we'll work with a plane that looks like this, where the small letter O is for open spaces, and then we can use a small letter X to indicate that a seat is taken or not. We'll have 4 buttons. One to create a new flight, so that will just put O's everywhere. One to make a booking, where the person can say in which row and column he wants to sit in. One for the totals, to give us how many of each row is taken and how many of each column is taken. And diagonals. Our diagonals will work with only the first 5 rows, because then we've got our first 5 rows and 5 columns. So a diagonal will top left to bottom right and top right to bottom left. We'll add up how many of those rows are taken in those diagonals. Okay, to start, let's go create our two-dimensional array. So let's call this one flight. It's also an array, and then same to our one-dimensional array, we'll indicate now our spaces. With this one, however, remember it's always rows first, then columns. So the rows, we've got 10 rows, so 1 to 10, and our columns, even though we're going to use A, B, C, D, E, that's just the names for the GUI. In our program itself, we have to give it digits. So that will be from 1 to 5 for our columns. They will be of, and then remember we're using O and X's. So for that you can go char or you can go string. I'm going to go with string for now. And that we can use. In our program, we're going to use our rows and columns. If you remember our one-dimensional arrays programs, basically in every single button we had our one for loop to go through each of the values inside the array. With our two-dimensional array, however, we're going to need 2 of them. We're going to use 2 for loops, one for the rows, one for the columns. So I'm going to create a row and a column integer variable here, just to make our life a bit easier, so that we can use these variables wherever we go. In this case, you'll see with majority of these buttons, well, actually all of them, we want to display this the whole time. So to make our life easier, we can actually go and put our display in another procedure. So we make a procedure so that we can reuse that code every time we want to display something. So we can go to the public area. No, we can actually just go on top here. And then we just say we're going to make a procedure. And let's call it display. Now what you do is you press Control Shift and C. Control Shift C, and it will actually create this piece for you. Now in a two-dimensional array program, the main thing for us is to, okay, so what we can do inside here with a two-dimensional array, the display is one of the main areas of a two-dimensional array, and if you understand this, it actually makes it a bit easier. So for display, the first part, whatever we do initially, will be right on top, because this is before the 2 for loops. So before you start displaying the whole section. You have to remember our two-dimensional array will actually save all the O's from there down to there. Only the O's. Our ABCDE is just the ones off, and that's just column headings. And our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is just row headings, and they are also basically ones off. That our two-dimensional array is this piece on the inside, and it's only the values. So remember now, when we created this 2D array, we just went 10 rows. We do not include this empty space as a row. And with columns, we just went 5 columns. We do not include this empty space, because these two empty spaces are just for display purposes. We don't want to use RAM space to store blank values. We just want to store the values, and when we display, we'll just insert these blank spaces. So in our display, our first step would be to do everything on top, so all our column headings. So in this thing, we're gonna go in our red display. We can maybe clear it so that every time we run it, it just starts clean. And then we can go in our red display .lines.add. We now want to add the headings. Now initially you'll remember that there's a gap there for our row headings. So to make this nicely underneath each other, we're going to use a tab. So we're going to add a #9. And then we'll start with our A and then a space and the B and a space and the C. And then for the aisle, we can just add another #9. And then we can do our D space E. That will do all our column headings for us. Now next step, now we basically have to start with our two-dimensional array. But we'll start with the rows always. So for a two-dimensional array, you can sort of try and remember, it will 99% of the time you'll need 2 for loops. So our first for loop is for the rows, and our rows, if you can remember, starts at 1 and it goes to 10 rows. Let's add the begin just to make our life easier. And then we'll also have a for loop for our columns. And you'll remember our columns has got 5. We've got 5 columns. Maybe just to help us remember, this is for the columns, this is for the rows, this is for the button. Okay, so for our rows, when we start each row, we want the 1 and then we want all the values next to each other. Now for us to nicely display that, we actually need a string variable, because you know, once we say redisplay.lines.add, after this statement it goes to the next line, and we want multiple values inside there. We need that value and that and that, so we need multiple 5 values plus our row heading plus our tab, all of that inside. So what we can do is we will go and create a variable for display, call it string, of type string, and then when we start this, so when we start the row, we want to clear whatever's inside there, because we're starting a new row. And then the new row needs to have a value of 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4 initially. So now we're lucky there, because we've got our for loop for R that goes from 1, then 2, then 3, then 5, 4, 5, and so forth. So we can just int to string this R. And then after we do that, then we want our tab again. So this will add all our row headings for us. It will put the R's value, which is 1, and then a tab. And then the R's value, and then a tab. And then the R's value, and a tab. So that will do all our headings for us. But now we want to get to the values itself. So this we have to do inside our for loop for the columns, because now we need to start displaying the first column's value, then the second column, then the third column, then the fourth, and then the fifth. So now in our display variable, we want to keep what's already there so that we can keep the row heading, but we want to add our array, which we called flight, at position row, at row R, and column C. We need to add that value. But then you can also remember, we always, like with our headings, we put a space after each of these values. So we can just add the space to it so that we can make it work nice. So this will now put the row heading, put the value, the O basically, or the X, and then a space. So that will display all of them nicely for us. But now remember, we only put it into the variable this. We never actually displayed this yet. So we must, after the C for loop, so after we're done with each of the columns, so after we've done adding all of the columns values, we need to display before we start the next column. So after the columns, but before we start the next row, we need to just go and display our variable this. Okay, so we can't test this yet because we just put it into a procedure. So what we can do, just for testing purposes, in our new flight button, we can just go call this procedure. And how we call it is we just call its name. We just write its name. So now we can play this program and let's just see what it does. Let's see how it looks. So when we click the new flight now, we've got our headings, we've got our numbers 1 to 10, and then there's nothing inside. Okay, reason for that, if you can remember a string variable that's global, always the initial values are blank, nothing. So it actually displayed everything but all filled with nothingness. So what our new button will do is we actually want to make the whole 2D array full of O's. And the O is for open seats. So whenever you want to do something with a whole two-dimensional array, you always need two for loops. So we'll start our first for loop with our rows, starting at 1, and we want to go to 10. You don't need the begins, so for now I'm going to leave out the begins, but if you want to put the begins, it's maybe good method just not to get confused. But I want to go through the whole two-dimensional array, so my rows must go 1 to 10 and my columns must go 1 to 5. And what I want to do in my flight two-dimensional array at position row and column, I just want to give them a value of an O. So this will put an O into flight 1 1, then flight 1 2, then flight 1 3, 1 4, 1 5, and then the rows becomes 2, and then column starts over. So then flight 2 1 will get a O, and 2 2, and 2 3, 2 4, 2 5. When it's 5, it goes back, rows becomes 3, column starts 1 again, so 3 1 gets an O, and 3 2, and 3 3, 3 4, 3 5, and so forth. So it will go through all 10 rows to all 5 columns, make them all O's, and then we'll run the display again. So let's see how this works. So when we do the new flight now, there we get it. So this looks good. Only problem is our aisle is missing and our emergency exit's missing. So the aisle happened after the third row. So what we do is in our display part, when we're displaying this, so after we're done with the columns, no, sorry, we said this wrong. It's not after the third row, it's after the third column. See column 1 2 3, after column 3 we want a tab. So what we do, so when our column, if our column is 3, then we want to use this, whatever this was, plus a tab. So this will add the tab when the column is 3. So when column is 1, it's going to do this, skip this. When column is 2, it's going to do this, skip this. When column is 3, it's going to add the value, then it's going to add a #9, and then it's going to go do 4, skip, 5, skip, and then I think this should work. So let's quickly see if this worked. And do new flight. Now, so after column 3, adds the tab. Now the only part we need is our emergency exit, which is after row 5. So now our rows, you'll see inside here we were busy with columns. That's why we did the column in here. But outside the column part, this is where we work with the rows. So we want to, so this is displaying each row. But we just said now we want to, after row 5, add a blank row. So that means after it displays row 5. So if our row is 5, then we just want to display another line of nothingness. So this will then, if it's row 5, do all its stuff, display row 5. So then if it's 5, then it will just add another one. So after row 5, it will add the blank row. Let's see if this is going to work. So now when we book a new flight, there we go. Everything nice and neat. Okay, so basically what we've done the display part, and we've done the initializing of the whole two-dimensional array, making them all blank, and then helping them through this. Main thing is, when we're working with a two-dimensional array, you must remember there's sort of always 2 for loops, always rows first, columns next, and when you refer to the array, it's always 2 things inside the square brackets. Same with arrays, arrays always got square brackets, and for a two-dimensional array, you'll have your row version there, comma, your column version there, to do what it needs to do.